Democracy depends on us choosing our views on political issues. But when the language used to describe those political issues is engineered in a laboratory to be divisive and can produce a 15-point difference in what we think about the political issues, are we choosing our views, or is the language choosing our views for us? I'm Tristan Harris, and this is Your Undivided Attention. Our guests today are Jedi masters of political communication, Westen and Frank Luntz. In some cases, our guests have used their Jedi master powers of language in ways that increased partisanship. And yet, whatever we might think of their politics, we can ask, how can we decode the divisive power of language?
Whatever things have happened in the past, I consider you both to be the best people on the earth in terms of holding up this tuning fork that can identify and find those resonant frequencies in people. And like you said, Frank, you can't invent the language from scratch. You have to know what it's resonating with. But it's an art and a science, and both of you are, I think, the best at it. What was a moment that had you recognize the power of language? I mean, it could be, when you discovered one of these key phrases. What was sort of a key experience or moment where you understood the power of language?
For me, it probably first happened doing clinical work, and it was listening to people on my side of the aisle do it so poorly. It was if there's one moment that I remember, it actually was 1988, watching the debate between Dukakis and George H.W. Bush, and when he got into his famous response to the question that Bernard Kalb asked him about, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty? And his response was, no, Bernard, I think you know that I've been an opponent of the death penalty my whole life, and I see no evidence that it's a deterrent. And I just screamed at the television. another one bites the dust. That the first thing that you say in a situation like that is, Bernard, if that happened to Kitty, the first thing I'd want to do is I'd want to get my hands around that guy's throat and be the first one to do it. But let me tell you why I wouldn't. And then you just talk genuinely about why you wouldn't, because he wouldn't.
Frank, I'm curious for you, and I think, go ahead.
The one that comes to mind first is during the debate about Obamacare, and I was in St. Louis, and I still remember the focus group. I remember the window. I remember the facility, and we're having this conversation, and the public kind of moderately liked what Barack Obama was trying to do. And we'd been through about 2 hours when someone raised their hand, a woman who was sitting in the front to my right, and I even remember she was dressed in red. And she said, we've been talking about healthcare, and I'm not really against what they're trying to do because they're trying to help me. But I really don't want it to become a government takeover. And I said to her, what do you mean by that? She says, well, government control, it means that they've got influence. But government takeover, it means I have no influence at all. And I look around the room and everyone's nodding their heads. And I'm always looking at body language. I look at the physical reaction of my participants. Are they leaning forward or backwards? Or do they have their arms folded, or are they more welcoming? And they start to nod their heads. And the next person behind her to her left said, that's exactly what this is. It is a government takeover. And then I hear this murmur from the 30 people in the room, 29 to be precise. Yeah, it is. It's a takeover. I don't want government running my healthcare. And I knew at that moment that I had the language to challenge Obamacare, that I had the language that would make it very difficult for them to be successful. I never created that phrase. It came from a focus group participant. My language, I'm not creating in a laboratory. My language comes from the voters themselves. I just know how to identify something when I hear it. And that one was clearly impactful.
And so in that example, what was the phrase? The phrase was government takeover of healthcare?
Yes, we had been using government control up to that point. And government control was significant. Government takeover was mind-blowing.
Frank, I never knew that came out of a focus. I mean, I knew it came out of a focus group, but I thought it came out of more of your head than a participant's mouth. I didn't know that. But what's so striking about Democrats is that they tend to either pick up language from the other side, is stepping right into a metaphor or an image that's come from the other side that's been used against them. So that, for example, government takeover is a great example where in trying to talk about extending Medicaid to people who don't have health care, Democrats call it Medicaid expansion. And what I always say is, think about what expansion is. You're going right in the heart of a metaphor that Ronald Reagan talked about government is taking over your life. It's big. I think big government is the phrase that's used by has been used by the right for 40 years. So why would you want to talk about expansion? You want to talk about extending Medicaid to people who are working 3 jobs and still can't afford it. I mean, when extending versus expansion are 2 completely different things that activate completely different networks in your head.
I'll give you the best example of Democratic failure was the phrase defund the police. Whoever came up with that cost so many Senate seats, so many House seats, and that phrase doesn't go away. It's still powerful right now. And I'm listening to Joe Biden talk about inflation, and he called it transitory. First, no one understands what transitory is, and second is people will think it's temporary. Well, what good is temporary if meat prices have gone up 22%, if gas prices have gone up 33%, if used car prices have gone up 40%, and by the way, notice I don't use the word inflation. They're prices, they're costs. The average individual does not walk into a supermarket and say, oh my God, look at that inflation. They say, I can't afford that. So I don't get it. After all this time, by the way, believe me, you'd be shocked at how little Republicans pay attention to what I tell them. I actually think that you would do better, Drew, preaching to Republicans, and I would do better preaching to Democrats.
It's funny because in my conversations with both of you in private, you actually speak very often about how little those who are communicating actually listen to people like you at really framing these things. And when you say it, Frank, out loud, it sounds so obvious. Like, of course, people don't relate to the phrase inflation as much as they would relate to the phrase, prices that are going up. Of course, if you talk about global warming in terms of Celsius, when most Americans don't know what Celsius is, or even talking about 2 meters of sea level rise, like we're in the wrong unit of measure. And metaphorically, that's what we're doing all the time. We're using phrases that are not as accessible. For fun, maybe just to allow you both to go on a little mutual rant for a second. Where do you see the parties just screwing up over and over again? Because one other thing our listeners might be thinking is, if it makes a change, but if it's only 2%, then it doesn't matter. But if it actually transforms the outcome, then it starts to matter.
That makes. I mean, you're looking at the difference of 15 points in public approval when you say expansion or expanding versus extending. And the same thing actually is true of something as simple as whether you mention Medicaid or Medicare first in a message. The average person knows Medicare. They know that it's something that their parents, their grandparents have, they really like. It's the most popular, other than Social Security. Those are the 2 most popular programs that that the federal government has ever put into place. If you talk about Medicare, people are right with you. If you talk about Medicaid, what they are picturing is long lines, crowded clinics, poor health care given to people of color in the United States. That's what they picture, either consciously or unconsciously. So if you say we need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get care as good as Medicare, whether through their private insurance or whether they get Medicare itself, or as a backup. We can extend Medicaid to people who are having to take 2 or 3 jobs just to get by, so that they've got health care for themselves and for their kids. If you do it in that order, you do great. If you do it in the other order, you first say something about Medicaid. We need to make sure that everyone has access to Medicaid. You just watch as you watch the body language Frank is talking about. It just gets deflated. Frank is known for having introduced style testing into our political lexicon, as well as into our toolbox for developing and testing language. And I do a lot of online dial testing, where what people are doing is they're listening to messages, and as they're doing that, they're moving a bar on their screen one direction, like say to the right, if they like what they're hearing, second by second to the left if they don't. And what it produces is a graph, a line that goes up and down that that summarizes everybody's responses or everybody in a group, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, Independents, whether it's separated by males and females, etc. And you can see just these enormous differences from if you start with Medicaid, you'll watch the dials drop, and then you have to do your best to pull people back up with Medicare. Versus if you say Medicare first, and then you say, and as a backup, everybody ought to be able to get Medicaid. You watch the dials keep going straight up, and that's including for conservatives who otherwise wouldn't have been happy with hearing about extending Medicaid at all.
We have this a similar example. If you talk about transparency, nobody understands it. Nobody can define transparency, but everybody can define accountability, which is why accountability is much more appreciated, much higher priority. Another example is the difference between evidence-based and fact-based. If it's evidence-based, it sounds like you're a lawyer, and lawyers are very unpopular in the country. But it's fact-based, these are statistical, these are provable. And so if you take a fact-based approach, you're dealing with hard information. If you take evidence-based, you're dealing with something that's more like intent rather than reality.